Nakasa was a prominent South African journalist and writer who died in exile in 1965. The award is awarded annually for courageous and brave journalism. It recognizes any media practitioner who has, among others, shown integrity and reported fearlessly. Let's cross live to that ceremony now.
Than I am of the people I'm supposed to be going after. Intimidated by the intensity of the scrutiny, and awestruck by what you have accomplished in this country in the last decade or so. And I had to restrain myself from going around asking for autographs. But I haven't yet been allowed my glass of wine. After that, I may be doing the rounds. So, I hazard that the average South African feels profound gratitude, like I do, for the role the media has played, and especially the role investigative journalists have played. But in my case, it's fresh in my mind, my recent experience of interacting with journalists. So when you ask, is it on or off the record, I'm still trying to work out exactly what that means. So from all the media attention I received 2 weeks ago, I suddenly find myself a lot more sympathetic to those people who have been interviewed by journalists who complain afterwards that they were misquoted or they were quoted out of context. I felt there was a disconnect between what I thought I said to the journalist who was interviewing me and the one that ended up in the script that was published. So if you'll just indulge me for 1 second, because I have to get this off my chest. I was asked by a journalist about how my parents felt about my appointment. I was a bit taken aback by the question, but I reckon that given that I hadn't actually done anything, they're going to just focus on tabloid-type questions. But I felt it's my responsibility not to be flippant and to answer every question as accurate, as honestly, and as with sufficient reflection. So I thought carefully about how I wanted to answer the question. In my head, I said, okay, there are 2 things I want to get across. 1, my relationship with my mother is complex. And the one thing I wanted to convey is that it's not fair to hold me responsible for what she does. That was the one thing. And the other thing I wanted to convey is that I'm older and wise, and so is she. So, things are not what they used to be. What ended up in the newspaper? And I quote, she was asked how her mother felt about her appointment. And she said, I quote, "Oh, she was probably too busy being glamorous to even call to congratulate her." That is kind of what I said, but not exactly what I meant. And so it was there for my whole extended family and group of friends to read. And they were all quite horrified. So what I learned from that brief little experience in the limelight was that be fair, be brief, but not every question needs to be answered with this deep level of introspection and candor and honesty. Because quite frankly, there's just not the bandwidth or the space in the newspaper. So keep it simple, I'm told, if you want to get across and report it exactly what you feel. But I think it also brought to me that no matter how you try and dress up a complicated issue, no matter how you sugarcoat, at the end of the day, the journalist is going to take that, break it down, and lay it bare, and you're going to have to deal. So, yes, I'm trying to mend that relationship with my mother. But to demonstrate that I've tried to learn, I'm going to try to stay on script, read the script, stay on it, don't deviate. But just to demonstrate that I did learn from that experience, I was going to say something about the fact that I was quite bemused by the media coverage and the positivity in the media about my appointment, because I kept thinking, I haven't done anything yet. So, what is the fuss all about? And I was saying to a friend, it's kind of like the Nobel Peace Prize Committee awarding Barack Obama the Nobel Peace Prize at the beginning of his presidency. But I thought best not to say that, because what's going to be the headline? Hermione Cronjé compares herself with Barack Obama. So, I'm learning. I'm still terrified, though. So, let me get back to the topic. I was asked to talk about the importance of a courageous free media in exposing and holding power to account. Now, that is what my 12-year-old would call a no-brainer. Of course, it is important for the media to hold the powerful to account. And more often than not, it takes tremendous courage for them to do so. But thanks to journalists like yourselves, and especially the ones being nominated this evening, our democracy has grown and has been enriched by your contribution. You have exposed information and scandals involving the powerful and the connected. One of the biggest scoops exposed by the long arm of investigative journalism, done right, was what we today call the Nkandla Gate, which the prosecution is still working on bringing some accountability to. The consistent crescendo, the noise, and a barrage of unrelenting questions from the media in 2011 galvanized other sections of society, activists, and political players to converge towards a single, greater objective: to protect this country from the corrupt. There are many other significant examples of exposés over the years, which have not gone without recognition in past media awards ceremonies, such as this, I imagine. Today, we have the State Capture Commission, known to the media as the Zondo Commission, but much to the annoyance of Judge Zondo. The PIC Commission, where we hear revelations on a daily basis of how those who occupied positions of power and influence broke people's trust. Same, the Nugent Commission, but particularly close to home for us in the NPA, the Mokgoro Commission. It's to you, I think, that we owe these commissions of inquiry, these exposés, these additional focus on what happened. So it's difficult to imagine that where we would have been without your digging, your exposure of the deep, dark secrets in important institutions of state, and your exposés of the plunder and the personal enrichment and the political machinations. Steinhoff, VBS, Bosasa, Eskom, Transnet, all of these investigations, all of these files that have passed over my desk in the last few weeks started with a journalist shining a light, asking questions, probing, refusing to be scared off. So the work that you have done is substantial. And a few months ago, a leader of an opposition party, whose name we won't mention, delivered a book authored by a journalist, who we won't identify, about the plunder of state funds through political patronage in a province we don't need to identify, to the NPA head offices in Pretoria. He presented the book to us as evidence, and he said, explain to me why they are not in orange overalls. So that's where you've left me. You've done all this exposing. Your efforts have resulted in the creation of these commissions of inquiry, and there's been an announcement in the media that there will be an investigating directorate who will now address state capture. What the announcement neglected to mention is that such a thing doesn't yet exist. So I was appointed as a director of a directorate that has yet to be established. And while I am creating that directorate, can I please, as soon as possible, ensure that warrants of arrest are issued and indictments are filed, and preferably the top echelon of the political class that has been the most corrupt stand in the dock? And what, like 3 months, is that going to be enough? So when Shamila Batoy was asked at a press conference a few weeks ago, how did she find the NPA? There was a long, pregnant pause, and she said, much worse than I had expected. Now, Shamila was out of the country for 10 years or so, and I've been out of the NPA for about the same amount of time. And I thought that I kept in touch and I kept abreast of what was going on in the institution. But even I have to say that the situation is a lot worse than even I anticipated. But I don't want to say that as an expression of doom and gloom. I want to say that it's important for us to look at these institutions, because journalists, and to some extent judges and organizations, NGOs, have had to bear the brunt of carrying this democracy through the last 10 years. And that should not have been the case. We have constitutional institutions that ought to have protected us from what happened. And so I think we really do need to reflect quite deeply on how it is and why it is these institutions failed so spectacularly. So it's not just that there isn't a directorate in place for me to head and do all this important work. The truth is, the institutions of state who had to do this job, whose responsibility it was to do this job, like the intelligence agencies who were supposed to alert us to the threat of state capture, the threat of the looting that's going on. So crime intelligence, the state security agency, were nowhere. In fact, as many of you are aware, they were spending their time monitoring journalists to try and prevent journalists from exposing what they ought to have been exposing. In the police, the state of affairs is, I would say, very similar to that in the NPA. And luckily, you don't have to take my word for it. The Mogoro Commission lays bare what happened at the upper echelons of institutions like the NPA and the police. They were, I don't want to use the word capture because some people feel like they don't understand what that means. These institutions, the police, the Hawks, the NPA, were compromised. And in two ways. Compromised in that they were just looted. More the police than the NPA, I would say. And the SSA was also looted. And they also, you don't have to take my word for it, it's well documented in an investigation conducted into the State Security Agency. But in the criminal justice system, there was a deliberate attempt to put people in place to ensure that those who are guilty of crimes avoid accountability. Now, so what Mokgoro did is made recommendations about two people, Advocate Jiba and Advocate Mkhwebi. But what about the rest of the organization? What about the police? And I think that for us to rebuild our institutions and for us to get them to play the role they were expected to play but failed spectacularly to play, we need to ask, how could this happen? How could large institutions be diverted in this way? And I think if I were to throw some of the work back to you that you all have thrown this way, getting South Africa to understand what happened and why it happened is important. Yes, there's a story about just straight criminality that is our responsibility to address. But I think there's a bigger story and a more important story, or an equally important story, about how the way South African society is organized, is structured. We are a deeply unequal society and growing more and more unequal rather than less. And we are unequal on many fronts. Income inequality, educational, access to educational opportunity, and all sorts of everyday common inequalities and divisions, particularly still around race. And I think we underestimate the role that those divisions played in getting us to where we are. So yes, the Guptas, the Watsons, and all these other names that get bandied about in the media are important to hold to account. But when I look at the NPA and I look at ordinary people in the NPA, my old colleagues, my former colleagues, and I ask, how did you let this happen? How did it get to a point where the politically connected did not get indicted? And what I'm finding, I think, is that it's the same thing, I think, that happens in all other parts of our society. The state-owned enterprises, journalists. What happens is there are those who see the wrongdoing and decide, actually, it makes a lot of sense to jump on this bandwagon because, there'll be no accountability. Then there are those who resisted and suffered greatly for it. The consequences were dire for them. But a larger group of people decided to keep their heads below the radar, not to make too much noise. I think someone at the State Capture Commission a few days ago said, I knew this was wrong. I went to two of my colleagues and I asked them, you know this is wrong, what are we going to do? And 2 out of the 3 said, I have a family, I have responsibilities, I need to earn my living. So a lot more people opted to not take on those who were doing wrong. But I would say that an even bigger cadre of people were not high enough to actually have an impact on what they saw was going on, and ended up feeling powerless to do what they thought should be done. And those people are the people I am excited to still work with, because they had their little passive resistance, but they did the jobs that they could do in the sphere that was open to them to do it in. But I think we need to understand the state of the NPA today is affected by all of that. So it's not just about removing 1 or 2 people at the top, or 3, and thinking that the organization is now ready to do business. It's now going to turn around, and there is a culture that is very difficult. And an interesting thing I find about the culture, which I'd be interested to hear how journalists deal with this, is that the old race divide is still very much what characterizes what went on. So there were narratives about it's the blacks versus the whites. The whites are keeping us out, so we need to fight to get promotions because they would never recognize our ability. That kind of narrative made it easier for people to say, well, there's a ring of truth to that. I'll throw my lot in because I've been around here working my backside off, but no promotion. So I think those kinds of things will continue to bedevil our efforts to build institutions. And as I'm trying to build capacity to do the work that needs to be done, it's unavoidable to engage with that. So those of you who were hoping I was going to tell you about all the other stuff that's going on, you know, who's first in line and what are the charges and what's the sequencing and all that, you'll have to wait for the next installment, because what I'm doing is grappling with exactly where we are. I know I don't have forever, so that's it. I'm done now looking at what am I dealing with? What is the nature of the beast? I've also started looking at how we're going to fix it, and I just want to give you 2 heads-ups about that. One, yes, I do have money. There is money for the Directorate. In fact, there is no shortage of money in both the public and the private sector to support the work of the Directorate. But it's a lot trickier to figure out how to spend the money. You know, all those rules and policies and procedures that were put in place to avoid corruption that are completely disregarded by the corrupt hamstring those of us who want to act quickly in the public service. And so while there is money, we are working on ways to rapidly spend the money. When you're told in the public service that it's going to take about a year to fill a vacancy, so if I advertise tomorrow, I might get a person appointed a year from today, clearly another plan needs to be made. And we have been trying to work on those plans. But, you know, building a competent and credible state institutions require leaders who can answer questions like that. Make sure that there remains fairness, that there remains accountability, but still get the job done. And not do what we've been doing in certain state institutions and certainly institutions like the NPA, where we have been fantastic on compliance. We have complied with every rule set for ourselves. As you know, we have the best conviction rate almost anywhere in the world, a 97% conviction rate, I think. So why is the public not very satisfied? Because what we're not measuring is, and what we're not asking ourselves is, what we're doing and what we're measuring actually having an impact? So I'll end off now, because I see my flags are going up, and I still have a speech that I must give. But what I wanted to end off with saying is that I am not pessimistic. I think Mandy is in the room. She was one of the first people to call me and ask, or put it to me, that I've been appointed in this position. And I gave a nervous laugh, and she said, "Oh, thanks, that's all I wanted to know." Not quite that. But she asked, I said to her, "Do you mean, will I be the sacrificial lamb to the slaughter?" If that's not mixing metaphors. And then she asked me the other day in a WhatsApp message after the announcement of the appointment, she said, "Still think you're a sacrificial lamb?" And I misread that, thinking she was saying that she thinks I'm a sacrificial lamb. And I stewed over it all day, thinking the cheek and the nerve. Eventually, I read the whole thing in context, as you should do when you, not just a journalist, but everybody else. And I read, and she said, no, that's what you said, not what I'm saying. And I said to her, well, I would not have taken this job if I didn't think we have a fighting chance. I think we have more than a fighting chance. Thanks to you guys, you've done the bulk of the work. My job is actually, it's a difficult job. It's not an easy job, but it's the job of trying to strategize, trying to steer a path, identify processes and procedures that will get us to where we need to be. But what you've done is laid bare the picture. You've laid bare what is the work. Mine is just to see how to get us there. But I didn't say it was easy. So what I do expect is that in addition to your important job of holding powerful people to account, there's also the job of taking people with you. And in our unequal society, that means not just the educated, the wealthy, the chattering classes, but everybody. Everybody needs to be part of this conversation and this evaluation of how we ended up. Because we all know that while there was this clear picture in the press about what was going wrong in this country, the electorate who voted didn't quite engage with that picture. And I think that's where the work for all of us is going to be going forward, because we're not going to end corruption by a few prosecutions only. We're going to end corruption with all of South Africa feeling that that is not something we tolerate as a society. And so we all have a role to play in achieving that. Thank you very much.
Hermione Cronjé giving a speech there at the Nat Nakasa Awards, speaking about the importance of journalism done right, celebrating the work that journalists have done, saying that for the past decade or so, journalists, judges and NGOs have done the heavy lifting of carrying South Africa's democracy, and imploring journalists to not just tell one side of the story, but to take all of the country with them when they're talking about why there's corruption or why there are issues, saying it's not just the educated and the so-called chattering class that need to be involved, but South Africa's general public that needs to be taken with. Thanks so much for joining us on The Full View. Good night.